Well, I don't know how much introduction Mike needs. Uh, he is pretty well known in SABR and certainly in the 19th Century Committee also. Last year, he was our keynote speaker at the luncheon at the Frederick Ivor Campbell Conference at Cooperstown. And Mike is, as Bob was saying actually before Mike signed on, he's always exciting, and you always learn something from him. If those were the exact words, but it was basically the sentiment. And so Mike threw his hat in the ring to be a moderator for the 19th Century Baseball Book Club, and he picked a doozy of a book, A Game of Brawl, which I read many years ago when Bill Felber had first written it, and it was just enthralled. And of course, there's a chapter in Inventing Baseball. I think it's called Good versus Evil or something like that. But in a way it encapsulates the game or the series that took place in 1897. So without further ado, I'll introduce Mike and turn it over to him. And Bob, if you have any particular instructions.
No, not that we're
we'll just leave everybody
pretty loose here. You got something to say, just be semi-polite. That's all.
Right. Okay.
Well, thank you very much for the kind words. And I'm so sorry I can't make it to Cooperstown this year. And I'll be so close. I'll be over in Boston, but I've got a day job conference I have to go to that weekend.
Those things
Hoping next year.
Away.
Yeah, exactly. I got to retire so I can spend more time there. Thanks a lot for letting me do this, because this is one of my favorite books. And I was looking over my, bookshelf with all my 19th century books. And I saw this one and I thought, God, I haven't read this in 15, 20 years, whenever it came out. And I picked it up, and that's what made me think, hey, I don't remember ever discussing this. And what I really like about this book are not only the way it's written, because I love the way that Bill sprinkles in, these interesting historical details, like when Bobby Lowe was brought back after his career to meet with Lou Gehrig because they both hit 4 home runs in a game. And then the little links to, the things that were going on. But the thing that I really liked is it touches on some topics that I've always been interested in. So I have 4 big picture questions that I would like to bring up, and I would love to have everybody else's perspective on this. And these are things that I think, that Bill highlights in the book, but were really very much a part of baseball in the 1890s. And I think they have real links today and some interesting questions. So the first one, not the one of most interest to me, but the first one is the line between aggressive, heads up, smart baseball play, doing anything to win. And it was kind of epitomized in this book by that quote from Jack Doyle. It wasn't a matter of being rough or dirty, but with the dead ball games, they were won by such very small margins that you did anything to win. So what's the difference between doing anything to win and cheating? Like holding onto a guy's belt sounds like it's really cheating, but if you miss first base by 3 inches, are you really going to go back and try and catch it? Or you just keep going on, and if you don't get caught, you just got lucky. And then if you intentionally miss first base by 3 inches, is that cheating, or is that just being lucky you didn't get caught again? And how does that compare to today? Banging on trash cans in the dugout, taking steroids, things like that. Where's the fine line between playing smart, heads up, aggressive baseball and cheating? So that's what I'm wondering, how everybody feels about that. I mean, steroids were not outlawed by baseball in the 1990s. So was Mark McGwire cheating? I mean, they were sitting there on his shelf in his locker and everybody saw him. So was that cheating?
I don't think it was regarded as cheating at the time so much. And I read read this book, but then I'm also thinking of all my research with the Cubs and like with King Kelly, and he did almost exactly the same sort of thing as what was going on in this Orioles book. He'd hide the books and he'd hide the balls in the grass. He would hide them in the outfield. He definitely cut off second base, but the people just seem to be amused by it more than anything else. But by reading this book, I think there was much umbrage taken, more umbrage taken, because I don't think King Kelly grabbed at people's belts, and they didn't really do any of the violent stuff. He was more trickery than anything else, and I think maybe that might have had something to do with it. It was still cheating, but it was a little good natured and a little just maybe shaving around the edges. While slugging somebody and holding on to someone's belt like they talked about was maybe going a bit too far. Yeah. Yeah.
You know, uh, there's a presentation at the Fred coming up next week, and I was thinking about you and this presentation, and of course the Bill's book. And the presentation is given by Tom DeLeese and Jay Seaborg. They're both from the Baltimore area, and the name of their presentation is the 1890s Baltimore Orioles and Scientific Baseball Controversy. So, was this scientific baseball?
19th century sabermetrics.
So I'm very curious to know what that presentation is going to be about, because there is this almost mythical belief that the Orioles, you know, was it dirty play or was it, well, I mean, things like the Baltimore chop, the idea of hitting the ball hard into the ground and, giving it a high bound and time to beat out the throw to first. You wouldn't say that was necessarily a dirty trick. It was something that they did, kind of developed it almost routinely,
Well,
So anyway,
people did have different views, and today have different views. I want to read a quick paragraph. How the game was played in the 1890s. Dirty, very, very dirty. The tactics of the 80s were aggressive. The tactics of the 90s were violent. The game of the 80s was crude. The game of the 90s was criminal. Baseball of the 80s had ugly elements. The game of the 90s was just ugly. And that's Bill James in the Historical Abstract.
that is correct. I've used that quote many times.
And I don't know what it was that drove that. I mean, you go back to, Anson, when he was made manager of Chicago, always argued with the umpires, always went after them. And that kind of, by the time you get to the 90s, you've got McGraw and Tebow and a dozen guys at Doyle and whatnot who just, everything was there to argue with because you might get lucky and get a decision in your favor.
I wonder if the reduction in the number of teams in the 90s, in most of the 80s, you had 2 leagues, 2 championships, 16 teams. And then all of a sudden in the 90s, you have a reduction to 12 teams and only 1 championship, really. I wonder if that had something to do with the increase of the competition.
Well, certainly in the 90s, you had just, you had Baltimore and Boston and Cleveland, and then maybe another team. The other 8 were just out of it by 4th of July.
This is I don't think I've ever read another book that had so much on the umpires. Bobby mentioned the umpires, like, was it Lynch, I guess, who got tired of all the people complaining about him, and he quit, mid-season or something like that. And I talk about other people, that they were really treated poorly. And all my other research, I know they were treated poorly, but they really emphasize in this book just how truly poorly the umpires were treated. And the rancor with the player, with even the fans throwing stuff at the carriages. I had heard of that before.
but the National League had beaten the Players League and the Union Association, and ultimately they got the American Association, but they couldn't beat the American League. And the big difference, at least to the fans, was how they treated the umpires
Yeah.
and how Ban Johnson tried to civilize baseball a little bit.
And that one guy wasn't named Lee. He took a baseball bat to somebody, and one of them was killed. One of the Lee Senior, I think, was killed. And my God,
Yeah,
yeah,
that was another issue I was going to bring up. That wasn't even a professional game. That was like
that's right. Yeah,
an amateur game, like
amateur game.
Little
Yeah.
League or something,
Uh-huh.
So, do you think, that quote from Bill James is really wonderful and really colorful, but is it out of context? I mean, was baseball any different than the rest of society in the 1890s? This is the age of laissez-faire business, and this is the age of, you had to be tough and hard scramble to survive, So was baseball really any different, or was it a reflection of, what you had to do to get by in life?
I don't know that the 90s were different from the 80s in their economic thing. In fact, they were, by the time 93 came and everything started to collapse a little bit, perhaps the teams, and that's not, no, it's not, it didn't happen then. It happened right from the beginning. Once they got rid of the Players League and they took care of the American Association, it was the old powerhouses of the National League, except for Baltimore, that led the way. Now Chicago was dipping down. They were kind of out of it for there, but Boston was still there, and Philadelphia was still around. Cleveland, who was back and forth between leagues.
What was kind of interesting, I read David Voigt's book many years ago. For a long time it sat on the shelf. It's called The League That Failed. And I always thought, oh, it must be an American Association. Until I pulled the book off my shelf one time and realized, no, it wasn't about the American Association. It's about the 12-team league from 1892 to 1899 that comprised the Major League, the national. It was really the National League. It was known as the National League, the big league. Yeah, and there is a lot of discussion in that book about the 1890s in terms of not just in terms of fandom, but in terms of like lifestyles and so forth and so on. And it is a kind of has that 19th century boom and bust. If any of the listeners here tonight had tuned in with any of Matt Albertson's presentations, he did the 4 books that were written by Rob Bauer on the Gilded Age baseball, baseball outside the lines. And a lot of those same problems went from the alcoholism and racism and things like that, right from the 1880s right into the 1890s. And I detected a little bit doing some research on 1890s players that were native to Staten Island in the major leagues. And I felt there was almost this resentment, because they were losers in the Players League war, in a sense. The players, had to go back, with their tail between their legs and play for the baseball maggots again, and so anyway, that's that.
And I think wasn't 1890, was it 1897? What was the year that they instituted the salary cap, $2,400 per player, which certainly had to stick in the craw of the players, right? That
Yes,
now all of a sudden there
Yeah.
isn't any competition for their services. Now there's
Yeah.
a salary cap.
right. Yeah, the Bush plan,
Yeah.
John Bush, one of the owners, was
Mhm.
got tagged
Yeah,
with
Rush.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was resentment for that, no doubt.
But they had that in the 80s also. I mean, the classification plan and the $2,000 lead. When the economy went down and baseball wasn't making the profits they were, you know, the owners have their standard reaction to it. Cut salaries. Well, of course, that's the biggest expense they've got also, but you've got, the problem is, how do you deal with the stars who are worth so much more?
Thank goodness we don't have that problem today, and the owners would never talk about that.
Solve that problem, didn't we?
Yeah, yeah. So that brings me to my second big picture thing, which is this wonderful quote from Al Spalding that Bill gives us. I do not know how better to characterize the monstrous evil which at this time threatened the life of baseball than that the owners care more about profits than the integrity of the game.
There's the pot called the kettle black.
Exactly. And of course, you know, baseball has been about business since at least, you know, the first day of the origination of the National League. But I couldn't help but think how often we've heard that same quote over the last 150 years, and how relevant is that sentiment today? I mean, the rumblings that we're hearing already from the owners and from Rob Manfred about lockouts, almost as if it's a standard thing now. We're going to lock you out until we can bend you to our will. And has anything really changed? I mean, over the last 150 years? Or are we stuck in the same spiral always between the business side and the tension between the owners and the players, that they seem to be treating this as a zero-sum game where every dollar has to be fought over, instead of the two of them getting together and saying, you know, if we work together and we just made the pie bigger, then we'd both be better off. Is there any solution to this?
Well, you know, it's something of human nature. You know, Rob Manfred was the keynote speaker at the SABR convention in Washington, D.C. It was supposed to have been the commissioner of baseball. He was not yet the commissioner of baseball, but he was the head of the law firm that represented MLB. So he pinched hit as the keynote speaker. And, you know, in the back of my mind was that case where, and he was the plaintiff lawyer in this case, which was MLB was the plaintiffs. And it was the idea, that case was built around the idea of, did the baseball statistics that were being used, like, you know, in Stratomatic, you know, I mean, all of these, leagues, what do they call them?
The fantasy leagues and
fantasy leagues,
yeah.
right? Yeah. Were the baseball statistics, didn't they belong to MLB? They ended up losing that case, thank God. But I was always thinking about, well, this, you know, when he became the commissioner, I said, well, you know, how much will change?
Well, at one time, I think it was around the same period, though, that he wanted to put a copyright on all photographs taken in ballparks of players and game action, though, which would really have been a bridge too far. I mean, as far as American, copyright. I'm not an attorney, but I mean, in terms of American copyright on images, that would be a total bridge too far, though. From what courts have ruled on, though, is my understanding. Though there's a big brouhaha in the newspapers at that time, I believe.
Imagine doing that today
Yeah.
with all the phones.
But one thing I wanted to mention, though, is I was just looking up here. In 1890, the average annual wage of a working person was $650 per year, and I think that gets back to the question that Michael posed about, is that behavior in baseball reflective of the era? And I would have to say certainly yes, from a lot of the people that were playing it. At $2,000 a year for a salary cap, I mean, it was either that's the best paying job you're gonna have, and it's either that or for a lot of them, it's going back to the farm or eking out an existence in the mines.
I think that's
So-
all true, except that the owners were willing to pay certain players even more. And
Right.
wouldn't follow their own rule, which was which was collusion, pre-collusion times. It was the same sort of issue. We go through all these things, and the issue is still the adversarial point of players versus owners. And as right now, as the owners figure out a new way to bring in another $1 billion, the players sit there and say, where's our share?
Yeah, that just seems to be baked into the cake of any, professional sport, though, really, any league, though.
But I think that bill really did capture though the fan enthusiasm, in these two cities. What began to come to a boiling point as the season came to its conclusion.
I agree with that. I thought Bill captured that so well and to me, what he set up was this whole conflict between, the rough and hard scrabble harbor town of Baltimore, which had the biggest cheats and roughest villains on the team, and then this kind of genteel, waspish Boston Brahmin, the educated, the genteel. And he almost set it up like it was, well, he did set it up, the good guys versus the bad guys, and why did this come to a head? Because Boston was there to save baseball. That's where baseball originated, and we're going to take it back and we're going to save it. It is just such a wonderful juxtaposition. And he really painted that picture so well.
Well, it's also interesting that even the dust jacket photo is of that big fan, the number one fan for that team. So I thought that was kind of not a typical baseball photo at all. It was a picture of a fan who, as I recall, got hoarse after the first game. It was out of the Tupple Cup or something. They had to put his ally in or something as aide. Yeah.
Well, Boston was very different because when they started to buy Kelly and Clarkson and those guys,
Yeah.
they were making a lot of money and they were willing to spend it because they knew if they got that quality of player, people would pay to come in, and it worked for Boston. Other teams didn't seem to have either the capital or, because certainly Chicago just kind of decided time has passed us, and we're going to cash in. Now Spalding is going to cash in with selling Kelly and Clarkson and whatnot. And then he fought the Players League fight and whatnot. And it didn't come up again until 1900 when they're trying to cap salaries again. And there was the fight between the executives. But just a point of one person put in the chat that about something we were talking about before about the dirty play. This is from Barry. I'm reading the biography of Bob Emsley. The author devotes a chapter to how bad it was for umpires, sports writers, for the newspapers were merciless, blaming the umps for every home loss. I remember reading an article probably 30 years ago. It may have been in Nash or some sport group that said there was no concept of an upset in the 1900s. In the 1800s. Nobody thought if you didn't win, it was either the umpire, a specific player, but if it was at a home game, it was the umpire.
Mhm.
Probably in most
Yeah.
cases it was, right? Because there was only one umpire who clearly could not see the whole field. So whatever he missed mattered to somebody.
But I didn't
Which
see
is why it's amazing that it took so long for the league to really say one more umpire would solve so many of the problems that we seem to have.
True enough, and that doesn't happen until the mid-aughts when the American League does it, and National League has to follow a couple of years later.
Well, remember I think it was in the beginning of the book when during spring training, they would have sessions on basically on how to cheat and, and,
Strategize, Jack. How to
strategizing. Yeah, that's the
strategize.
word I was looking for, the strategizing sessions. Yeah. On how to do all that thing,
Put some lipstick on that pig.
yeah.
When I look at that one umpire thing that went on for so long, I don't think the owner saw that as a problem. It was their choice. I think they really, on balance, liked the outcome that way. The arguments, the uncertainty, fan involvement, whatever, I don't know, but they must have liked it.
But they also didn't want to pay for the extra umpire.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, they didn't
Mhm.
consider that, they didn't consider that small amount of money worth paying.
No, they didn't.
There was a benefit that offset even that small amount of money.
Because the National League, it was almost volunteer umpires that they paid $10 or $20 a game when they started, when the American Association had 4 umpires that they hired was their employees. The National League had to respond a few years later because there were good umpires and bad umpires, and whoever was paying the most, it was not unlike players. That's where they went.
It was it in the afterword or one of the last chapters that he talks about the number of guys. There were like 80 different umpires who umpired in at least one game during that season,
Mhm.
and only a handful of them umpired more than half the games. So it's
Yeah.
like,
Mhm.
they came
all
and they
been good.
went, and they couldn't all have been good with that many, right?
There was one umpire who was like an amateur boxer, and when one of the opposing players or the manager challenged him to a fight, he just said, "Heck yes, I'll go out there under the stands with you." You know?
They all should have been ex-fighters.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But they
Almost the
got
only way
no
to survive.
support. If they called something that was controversial and they didn't call it for the home team, the league did say, "Oh, the umpires make a choice." It wasn't until Ban Johnson came along that they were going to treat the umpires at least with some modicum of respect.
Yeah, I think that probably had a huge that was probably a huge factor in the whole, view of the 1890s, like Bill James characterized it as violent and crude and rough and full of cheating, is that there's only one umpire, and the umpire, like you said, wasn't really supported by the league. It was kind of a laissez-faire thing, and you pressed every advantage. If you could intimidate the umpire into changing his call by having beaten somebody up prior, then that's what you do.
Mhm.
And as bad as it was in the majors, it was worse in the minors.
Yeah, I can imagine. So something that Jack said earlier dovetails interestingly into another kind of big picture thing that I had, which was I had forgotten that those rabid fans, the Royal Rooters, actually started with the Boston National League team, not the Boston Red Sox, with whom they're actually much more famous. And it kind of occurred to me that, when I was reading the book and, Bill points out, they almost overnight switched their allegiance from being rabid Boston National League fans to rabid Boston American League fans. And I was wondering what is it that, I mean, I cannot imagine ever becoming a rabid White Sox fan, for example. What is it that causes such a switch in loyalty like that? And how does anyone do that?
Losing causes it.
It didn't stop
Yeah.
me for years with the
Yeah.
Cubs. That can't be it.
Yeah, here, Mike.
After 1998, 1898, the Boston National League team was old and going downhill, and the American League team was a new thing. They had all the best guys, and they won. They won in 3 and 4. That automatically changed everyone's mind about it. But during the 1890s, of course, the National League team, this team was the best.
I had that shirt on the other day, and I was looking at the play. Dixie, I had that shirt on the other day, and I was looking at the players that on the back of the shirt of a list of the players that appeared in that decade. And it was absolutely amazing, who they had,
Yes. Salih had good talent because he knew good talent. Joanne,
Yeah.
would you please tell the assembled masses who was the real best fan in Boston?
Well, enough said McGreevy.
No,
All right. How about Hi Dixwell?
that's right.
Okay. All right. Yeah. He was the one that, well, he got mad at the National League team because they wouldn't give him season tickets. And so he went over to the Boston Americans. They weren't Red Sox yet. The Boston Americans, because they would. And he was the one that turned over the first shovelful of dirt for the new ballpark. And so he got a lot of attention, and he also showered a lot of gifts on the new players and everything. Oh yeah, he fulfilled a lot of those different roles.
And he was involved. He was involved in the game prodigiously 10 years before anybody heard of McGreevy.
Well, that is true. Yes, he was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, and he was what do you call it? A legacy baby, in other words.
Trust fund baby.
Trust fund. He was a trust fund baby, but he was told to get that money, he had to be gainfully employed.
That's right.
At some sort of an occupation. So what did he do? Well, he had this sideline with a furniture store, but that was not. It was only a front. He was actually collecting baseball stats at that time. And he even had a secretary that would assist him with that. So he was like a stats man long before there was such a thing.
The original Elias.
Yep, exactly. And he was quite a character, and he wore very flamboyant clothing and a very large top hat, and he was very short. And oh yeah, and there's a few other. Well, I'd done the presentation on him a few years ago at the 19th century, and I won't give away all of the secrets about Hi Dixwell, but it's really great because the thing is that I had gone down to Mount Auburn Cemetery many years ago when I was doing the research on Dixwell, and I go into the room there where you can ask him to look up where the grave is that you want to go visit. And I said, yeah, I'd like to, could you tell me where Arthur Dixwell is buried? And he goes, and does not look down at his big book. He looks straight at me. He says, well, you go down the Central Avenue, you go to Little Rise on the Hill, and you take a right, and you go around the curve here, and it's right there. You'll see the brownstone things and all that, and that's where he is. I said, okay. So I go and I do that. And I said, wait a minute, I'm going back there to ask him, well, how did he know that? Of all the thousands of gravestones that are in that beautiful graveyard. And so I said, okay, how did you do that? He says, oh, well, yeah, I know about Hi Dixwell. He is connected family-wise with the Bowditch family, which the Bowditches were a little bit across the way from him, across the pathway. And he says, sometimes if it's the right sort of group, and I'm giving a tour and it includes the Bowditches because he's right there, if it looks like the right kind of crowd, I'll take them over there and give them the whole story about Hi Dixwell. So anyway, so we started to trade secrets and everything. And he says, well, you know about that lawsuit? Yeah, I know about the lawsuit. I said, do you know why he was such a fan of the theater? He would go to every play. Sometimes he would go to every single performance of plays that he really liked, but he would always buy 2 tickets. Do you know what the second ticket was? Because he would always go alone. But what was the second ticket for? He says, what? He said, for his hat.
Oh.
It was absolutely great. Yeah, I won't get into the other things, because this is, we want to be a little more highbrow as to what that lawsuit was about. But if you were at the 19th century conference when I gave that, because when I showed all of it, it was so funny because Jerry Casway was sitting way up at the back of the amphitheater, so to speak, and I got to it and everything, and there was a little news report that was on it, and there was a pause in the crowd, and then all you could hear was Casway laughing his head off up in the back. It was great. It was just
That was a memorable presentation.
it was a very memorable one. It was really fun. But Hi Dixwell was really he was the quintessential early Boston typical Brahmin type baseball fan, of which there were many of them. There were quite a few of them, and a lot of them have great stories.
Mike, it's not an easy line to draw, but if you start with the National League in '76 and it goes through, and it's the stronger league in the '80s because the American Association didn't have the management, didn't have the capital, a number of the owners just thought they could kind of sail through a season and live off the gate. But by the time we get to the '90s, the National League, for the reason they were founded, everything's gone. There's Sunday baseball. They're serving liquor at the ballparks. There's no, and the National League just got hidebound to some extent. And by the time you get to they were able to fight off the Players League, and I think an awful lot of that was because Spalding understood how finance worked, and he really manipulated the other guys, particularly the negotiations. But by the time they get into the '90s, there was no Sodden was the owner. Rogers was a fairly strong owner, but there wasn't strong ownership anymore, and that's why the American League was successful to some extent. The National League was still fighting what they were going to do in 1900 and 1901 and 1902, and kind of gave the store away to the American League to let them rise.
So that I understand. My question was about how, as a fan, do you turn from one team to another so quickly?
Well,
And Dixie pointed out, he said, hey, you go with the winner.
Well,
I guess it's because the Cubs were never a winner for the first 50 years of my life that I never appreciated that.
I grew up and was there when the Mets came to New York. And the Mets, by the second season, were the darlings. They're still losing 100 games a year for 5 years or whatever it was. And the Yankees were still winning pennants till 64, but they weren't drawing. So there's something about the way you present yourself to the public that these things happen.
Do you think
it
it's
wasn't just winners, because the Mets were the lovable losers?
Well, so I'm wondering, is it like the novelty? The Red Sox were novel, the league was novel. The Mets, like you say, the Mets were the new kids on the block. They were almost the polar opposite of the Yankees, right? They didn't have the money, they didn't have the players. They played in a freaky old stadium that shouldn't even have been there anymore. And yet everybody loved him. They had Casey Stengel, who used to be with the Yankees.
Well, the Yankees were the
one
evil
of the
empire.
things one of the things I recall reading about that time in New York, and it's certainly verified from people that grew up as Mets fans when they started out, was among kids, there was such a backlash to the Yankees because they had always outlawed banners in Yankee Stadium. And the Mets embraced banners, and they embraced signage at Yankee Stadium for fans to bring. And fans felt involved there. And I think that was the big cultural difference at the time.
I think also the Red Smith said it, rooting for the Yankees is like rooting for U.S. Steel. And the Yankees were the only game in town for 4 or 5 years, and they couldn't capitalize on it because they were the only game in town. They thought, well, we're winning pennants, that's all we have to do. And the Mets came along and entertained people.
And the Yankees' attendance was lousy during those few years too.
They got really bad in the mid 60s. From about 63, 64, 65, and by 66, you know, they were in the bottom of the league.
Well, that's because all of the players that the people were used to were old and retiring, or
True.
just not that good anymore. And the same thing happened in Boston. The 1890s were great until 1898, while they won. But 1899, 1900, all of the players that were great for those 8 or 9 years were older. Some of them had left, but they were all older and not contributing what they had been able to before. And the American League team was brand new and it looked great. And so they just filtered over there. It was only 700 feet. Remember that. Only 700 feet from one ballpark to the other ballpark.
When did Seeley leave Boston and end up in Chicago?
I think 1902.
Yeah, it was the
Yeah.
winter of 1902, I think. He was
Right.
there 03, 04, and kind of brought in all the players that won those 3 straight pennants, but he was gone before they did it. I think he got sick, didn't he?
Yeah.
I think he did,
Boston,
yeah.
he had 5. 91, 2, 3, 7, and 8.
Yeah, and then say Lee went to the Cubs.
Yeah,
And
he
he brought
brought
in-
Bobby Lowe with him.
Yeah, and he brought in
He brought in
Tinkers, Rivers, and
Tinker,
Chance,
yeah,
and- yeah.
brought in those guys too.
So
And by that time, Kid Nichols left. The only guy left on the team really was Herman Long.
Who couldn't
and
steal.
a couple of those guys actually went over to the Red Sox too. Didn't Jimmy Collins go over to the Red Sox and then
Yeah,
become the
he did.
manager? Yeah.
Who did.
So I guess I can see there was enough connection, and all you had to do was turn the other way out of McGreevy's saloon to get to the different ballpark, so it wasn't a hard change to make.
Same pathway. And by 98 and 99, Collins was the best player on the National League team. So switching over to the American League team, that of his fans, it was easy for them to go over.
Okay, so the last big picture thing I had, my favorite part of the book, after reading through the book, you get so invested in these players. I loved the afterword, which kind of said what happened to every one of them.
I know.
But the thing that struck me the most about that was how many of those players went on to become managers and how many went on to become really good managers, like
Mhm.
McGraw and Jennings and Wilbert Robinson and Jimmy Collins. And so it got me thinking, what was it about those guys that translated into being such a good manager? And what is it that makes for a good manager? Because it clearly isn't just being on a great team. Hugh Duffy was not a good manager, and a lot of those other guys weren't. But what makes a good manager for a team? And is it different today than it was back then?
Well, some of those great managers, you got great managers. So when you look at somebody like McGraw, and then you realize that Casey Stengel played for him, the old professor, and then realize that Yogi Berra played for Casey Stengel. And, you begin to get this kind of lineage, and that goes on in other places also, by the way. I mean, I just, being in New York, I'm a little bit more aware of it from a New York perspective. But, it's the, it's the way it kind of was.
Was it the strategy of the 1890s, perhaps, Mike? The idea that you're always fair or foul, you're trying to find ways to win a ball game. And these are the guys that spent a lot of time trying to figure that out. Patsy Tebow did the same sort of thing. And he won some in Cleveland before the turn of the century, but he didn't do much after that. But the idea, these guys were all very detail oriented, and they weren't friendly managers when they got successful in the 20th century. They were the hard guys saying, I'm the boss, you do it or you're gone.
That's what Frank Chance said. Is you do it my way or I'll meet you under the stands. But the beginning of the book, they talked about some of the good managers and there's the basic philosophies and they really detailed how like one person wasn't a particularly good player, but he became a good manager and just his whole attitude at attracting good players. And he just in fact, well, I can't remember the guy's name, but one owner uh, knew that the guy was rejected as a player and rejected as this, rejected as that, but he recognized something in him that he became a good player, and I think later became a good manager too. Uh, just that the owner just recognized something that he could contribute a lot to the team.
Yeah, when you read Bill Rysack's Red Sox and Red Stockings and Blackguards and Red Stockings, uh, the history of the National Association of the 1871 to 75 period, and Harry Wright just is like heads and shoulders over everybody else in that league. I mean, they switched teams and things like that, and teams came and went. But for those 5 years or so, he was just heads and shoulders above everyone.
Mhm.
I think that if you look at some of the players that became managers, a lot of them were under Hanlon. And so
Yeah.
Hanlon was clearly an innovator and structured. And so I think that definitely was part of some of the makeup of some of the people that came from him, especially McGraw.
Yeah, Ned Hanlon was particularly in that mold of. He was almost like the first mover in a sense, in creating like McGraw and creating all those the fellow that Wilbur Robertson and what's his name from the Tigers,
Jennings.
yeah, Jennings, Hugh Jennings, and just to watch that progression take place. And Hanlon is definitely a guy who passed on a lot to future managers.
So management is more a do as I say, not as I do. Because I mean, a lot of those guys, something like McGraw was a star and Jennings was a star, but Frank Salee was never a star baseball player. And some of these managers, especially when you think of more modern managers like Earl Weaver and Walt Alston and Tommy Lasorda, who were so successful, they were never successful baseball players. They
Right.
played the game, they knew the game, but they weren't Ted Williams, who was really a terrible manager, for example. So is it that if you're not that good, do you have to spend more time thinking about the game to try and get an advantage, and then that naturally leads you into being a better manager?
Well, I think it's a head game in a sense. I think some people have some real like natural talent, like physical talent to be able to hit the ball or run down a fly ball or whatever. But other guys, in a sense, get to really know the game, and just devote so much of it. That's what my theory is.
I look at somebody like Ron Washington, who's managing the Angels right now, and I can remember him as a utility player with the Twins here. I believe he was on the '87 World Series team though, and he was a utility player who could play, all the infield positions, and wasn't a star certainly though, probably the 23rd, 24th man on the roster, perhaps even though. But he had a long major league career. A lot of times he was platooned for. Spent a lot of time sitting on the bench observing, and I think those people that do sit on the bench observing the game, are the ones that many times make the best managers, though, or succeed to that position, though. That's a feeling that I've always had, though, because I mean, there's always been, their share of journeyman ball players who have succeeded as managers.
Yeah, the journeyman ball player manager can probably relate better to all the journeymen that make comprise the majority of most teams. And maybe that's what's going on, the shared experience.
The word for that is players manager, I think, is what they
Yeah.
usually call them today.
Hmm.
You know, they say that uh, Stan Musial was such a generous person, you know, that he would like anybody who asked him about any hitting advice, you know, and Stan would just, you know, spend like, you know, half an hour with the guy and just say, do this and do that, you know. And he was the most giving of people, but nobody really could replace his natural ability. You know? He couldn't transfer it, you know. Just hit
I
the
remember
ball. That's
I met Musial back in the 80s, and somebody asked him, how come you're always so happy and friendly and whatnot? He says, well, when you go to spring training and know you're going to hit 330 that year, you're going to be in a good mood.
That's why Rogers Hornsby was so disliked, on the other hand, because he was so good, but he expected everybody to be that good. And he never, I mean, Billy Herman made the comment that he never talked hitting and never talked anything. He just expected you to go out there and do it.
Mike, Ken Fisher put something in the chat here. Why wasn't more pressure put on dual-owned teams like St. Louis, Cleveland to even out their rosters? I guess it's the whole question of the syndicate baseball at the end of the decade.
Oh, I think it was because of something you alluded to earlier. There were not enough people out there who had the kind of money that they needed to run a team. And so if you had someone, they ran two teams because you needed them in the league. And eventually, it didn't take too long to figure out that the evils and the downside of that were way worse than the upside. Like it would be if Bill Gates came along today and wanted to own a couple of teams, well, he easily has the money to do that. But the conflict of interest is just going to be outweighed by the great amount of capital that he can bring to the team.
Also, there was no central league management, really.
Yeah, that's a good point.
That would have pushed against the formation of those syndicates.
Well,
Yeah, it would have taken the rest of the league to do it, right? A whole bunch of them would have had to come up against it.
Yeah.
You know, Spalding takes great pride in being like the guy that broke the back of the idea of the syndicated baseball. And I won't forget now, that came down to 4 National League owners for syndicated baseball and 4 against it. And,
Yeah.
you know, Spalding was like in a way, he was, well, he wasn't officially an owner, of course, by that point, but he was, involved with the National League and had a position in the National League. And he finally broke the back of the syndicated the owners. And
Yeah, he was clearly very influential, helped that he knew all of those guys and was a very successful businessman who earned that respect as well. And I think he deservedly gets the credit for that because he really did, I think, explain to them that this is a bad long-term investment if you're going to be doing this. And he turns out to have been absolutely right. He doesn't get the credit he deserves for, I think, saving the National League from itself. It could have collapsed completely, and the American League could have taken over everything in 1901 or 1902 if baseball had continued down that path. That it could have been a very different outcome. I might be a White Sox fan to this day, which is horrifying to me. But.
Yeah.
And when they dropped the 4 teams at the end of 1899, 2 of them were big syndicate teams, and 2 of them were just god awful managed
Right.
teams who had no money.
Yeah, I mean that was the kind of thing that it was necessary at the time, and you wonder if that wasn't an example that Bud Selig was using in 2000 when he was talking about contracting the National League. Hey, we've done this before and we came back stronger. Maybe we should do it right now.
You must be still angry about 1906.
Yeah.
I remember it very well.
Mike, I'd like to,
One thing about Salih is that I don't know what he had on those players, because everybody knows that he wasn't a player himself, really, but he had tremendous respect from all of those great players that he had. He certainly knew how to pick them out of a crowd.
Yeah.
But if you look at the amount of times that they were thrown out of games, he demanded a couple of things only. You play hard on the field and you watch your step off the field. And if you look at how many times they were thrown out, they might have been thrown out once or twice in 10 years. Whereas everybody on Baltimore was thrown out every other day. So that's the way Boston played against what Baltimore played.
Mike, I got to ask you a question. This book has a foreword by Edward Kennedy. And I read it many years ago, of course. And did you get an opportunity to read that?
I did
And if
not reread it this time.
Okay. But I thought it was, I thought it was a real coup. And my impression of it back then, and still today, was that Kennedy probably took the time to do that himself. You know, he really kind of personalized it and talked about going to the game with his grandfather, who was mayor of Boston, Honey Bear Fritz, and it was a really interesting, how should I say it? It was a kind of surprise to see that Edward Kennedy would do the forward into a baseball.
I think it was a coup that Bill got him. It was such a great connection, though, right?
Yeah,
because it was his grandfather was one of the original Boston fans, and so it was great. I don't know how he got him, but it was a great one.
He'll tell us someday.
So my favorite part of the book was the afterword. I kind of mentioned that before. Just you get this wonderful relationship with all of these players and figures, and then at the end, you find out. I mean, in some cases, the really sad endings, that some of these guys had. The suicides. Marty Bergen killing his whole family, and then Louis Sock Alexis, dying in the woods trying to keep himself warm, and Herman Long and Ed Doheny going crazy. And then the other thing that always strikes me is the post baseball career that these guys had. There was no pension back then, and even though they were making really good money, it wasn't enough to retire for most of them. And so you have guys, working at the parks department and being, guards and working at a hardware store, and I'm just trying to imagine in 10 years, bumping into Mike Trout while he's raking leaves for the city of, Anaheim, or, Max Scherzer working behind a bowling alley, I don't think those are going to happen.
And that's why people like Ohtani have their huge contracts paid out over, 30 years or 40 years.
Yeah. I don't think that he's ever going to have to worry about, getting a job at a hardware store. So.
Bobby Bonilla saw that coming.
The most brilliant contract ever done.
They're still paying out.
Right. It was a great deal for the Mets because the amount they paid to amortize that, it was about a third of what the interest rates were going for. They're making money on that contract to this day. They have no regrets for paying that out.
Tell me something in the afterword. Did it erroneously say that Herman Long died friendless and penniless?
I think it said he was one of the guys who had tuberculosis, I think, and he died in Denver. I think it said he died destitute. I don't remember if it said he died friendless, but
that is completely wrong. That's like listening to Fox News.
So did he not die in Denver? Did he not die penniless?
He died in Denver. He died at the Oaks House. The Oaks House was a place where tuberculosis people went.
Mm-hmm.
It was an unbelievable, huge, luxurious place to stay, which was run on donations. But it was an unbelievable place. And it's where Salih died a month, 2 months before. almost in the same room.
Yeah, I knew that they were both in Denver at the end of their lives.
But there were a couple of benefits for Long, and so he had a little bit of money. But Bill Everett of the White Stockings was his best friend. And Bill Everett tended to him almost every day at the end of his life and made sure that the body got back to Chicago when he finally did die. So he did not die penniless or friendless.
Got it. So there were a couple other things that struck me about this one. I love some of the turns of phrases that Bill had, like "Dirty Jack Doyle." There was nobody who could curse in a wider variety of expressions. So I think, oh, what a wonderful thing to have been said about you. That your gift for cursing was so good. But I couldn't think of something like, in the 1890s, the Boston Brahmin cast was very concerned about all of these, this influx of Eastern Europeans and Irish, and how we're concerned with that right now. And it's not Eastern Europeans and Irish we're worried about, but we got this whole, the whole idea was they're changing our culture here in Boston. And it's a very 21st century problem that we're dealing with too, So.
Peter, you want to give us a close?
Well, Michael, I gotta say, you generated a lot of discussion here. And that's what this is all about, is participation. And I think you accomplished that mission very well.
Well,
We
I
had
had so much fun. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Mike.
One
The
thing,
pleasure to have.
one thing, tomorrow at noontime, I'm having pizza lunch with Herm Krabenhoft and Pete Palmer up in New Hampshire. You want to come? Everybody's invited. Paulus House of Pizza.
What
Come on
time,
up.
Dixie?
Huh?
What time?
Noon. He said noon.
Noontime.
I would love to be there. Tell Herm I said hi.
All right.
Yeah,
We're working on a paper
We'll see.
together right now, so.
yeah, we'll see her next week too. Yep.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, I'm
Dixie-
rooming with him
and
in the
Dixie, thank you,
frat
Dixie.
hotel.
Thank you for stepping up. All right. So, thank you again, Michael. I appreciate it very much, and it was a nice job you did with Bill's book. Bob, I want to just say that we have coming up our final presentation for the 19th Century Baseball Speaker Series, and that's going to be Tim Newby with his talking about Pete Browning, and that'll be in in May. And also in May, a little later in the month, I think it's the 23rd, I'll be doing David Block's new edition of Baseball Before We Knew It. It's his 20th anniversary edition, in which he's added 2 chapters and a new foreword by John Thorne. So it'll be kind of interesting. A little bit of a challenge that book is, but it is very, very important book in a sense.
The speaker series by a newbie is the 13th, Tuesday the 13th.
Yeah, the 13th, May the
And I
13th.
believe you're the Thursday the 22nd.
On Thursday the 22nd. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for clarifying that. Okay. So we'll see you all, or some of you who wants to tune in next month in May at either the book club or the speaker series. And this is the last one of the speaker series of season 5 with Bob Bailey's idea. What do we do for the pandemic? It turned into a 5-year program. And I'll see some of you at the Fred. I'm looking forward to that. Be
And
well, and thank you for tuning in.
for next year's speaker series, we still have a couple of open slots. If somebody wants to put an abstract in,
Yeah.
we would be glad to see it.
In fact, later, just a little bit after this session is over, I'll be sending out a 30-day notice. Exactly 30 days now to the deadline for the abstracts for the 19th Century Speaker Series Season 6, which will start in September. Okay, thank you again.
Okay.
Bye, everyone.
Good
Bye.
night, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks
Thank
for
you.
coming.
Thanks, Mike.